Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Roman.
And I'm Michael.
Investing is an uncertain journey where chance, risk and luck are constant companions. But can understanding probability help us live with the unknown?
To answer that question, our guest today is Sir David Spiegelhalter, the UK's preeminent statistician and author of The Art of Uncertainty. And in today's dumb question of the week, we ask, would you want to know when you will die?
All right, let's get into it. So we're delighted to be joined by Sir David Spiegelhalter, Emeritus Professor of Statistics at the University of Cambridge. David has spent his career dissecting data to understand risk and how we might deal with uncertainty. He was previously the president of the Royal Statistical Society and sits on the board of the UK Statistics Authority. He was knighted in 2014 for services to medical statistics and is something of a national treasure. His new book, The Art of Uncertainty: How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk and Luck, is the best way to learn about probability. Probably. Thanks so much for joining us, David.
Oh, a real pleasure to be here.
So maybe the best place to start is by unpicking some of those terms in the title of your book. You cover things like chance, risk, luck, and then even things like coincidence. What's the best way of thinking about these things and the relationship between them?
I put all those words on the title because they are all aspects of uncertainty. They all deal with things that we don't know about. I quite like, as a definition of uncertainty, the conscious awareness of ignorance. And that might mean ignorance about the future, about, when we're confronted with risks. It might be ignorance about what's going on at the moment, what's happened. It might be, our surprise at unexpected things that happen to us, whether they be coincidences or disasters. And then it also really goes into luck, because it's when unpredictable things happen to us, which are out of our control and yet have a big impact. And I see all of these as manifestations of uncertainty.
Now, you warn about the perils of sloppy language around probability. So how can it go wrong?
Yeah. Well, one of the arguments in the book is that we're faced with uncertainty in our lives all the time, and in our daily existences, we get on very well with saying, something could happen, and it might happen, or it's very likely that this will happen. But when it comes to important decisions, using casual words like that can be disastrous, and argue very strongly in the book that for important decisions, we should try to have at least a rough mapping of words onto a scale of probability. The example I use in the book of where this went very wrong was at the Bay of Pigs, which was a 1961 plan by the CIA to use Cuban exiles to invade Cuba to topple the Castro's revolutionary government. And President Kennedy, when he became elected, found out about this. He didn't know about it beforehand. It was a real secret. Nobody knew about it. And asked Army intelligence to have a look at it and see what they thought about it. And they didn't think much of it at all. They thought it had a 70% chance of failure, or 30% chance of success, perhaps. Unfortunately, that number got dropped out of the report, and it was replaced by the phrase "a fair chance of success," which was interpreted quite favorably. I'm sure this wasn't the only reason why the fiasco went ahead. In the end, it was, of course, a complete disaster, and there were huge recriminations about why weren't they warned? Why didn't Kennedy warn about what a absolutely low probability success there was? And this has actually led intelligence communities to be, some of the most prominent in using probabilities now to assess chances and assess risks. Not on the basis necessarily of a data analysis, but using judgment based on the best intelligence analysis they can come up with. So, for example, within the UK, all the intelligence services have a probability yardstick that's public. And so that if MI5 or MI6 or something, anyone there uses the term likely, they mean between 55% and 75% probability. To try to avoid these misunderstandings that can occur again and again through words meaning different things to different people in different contexts.
But this whole classification of turning what are quite subjective judgments about probability and just communicating them with words, it reminds me of the risk rating we get with investment funds, where to communicate it to everyday investors, it gets slapped with a label between 1 and 7, where 1 means the lowest risk, the lowest volatility, and 7 means the highest. Now, that doesn't strike me as a particularly informative way to communicate these relative risks and uncertainty. And in fact, we saw in the crash of 2022, the lowest risk funds crashed way more than the highest risk ones because bonds stole off more than stocks. What have you found about better ways to communicate probabilities to everyday people?
The first thing is that people can understand probabilities, provided they're communicated really carefully and thoughtfully. It depends crucially on the audience. Within, a group of people who all think the same and with a lot of common experience, then they may develop a language which works rather well for them. So, in the world of adverse drug reactions, the term common means between 1% and 10%, which bears no resemblance to the way the word common is used commonly.
Yeah.
But in that community, that's the way the language developed. And so the use of language and scales for communicating, putting words into numbers, is great, provided that everyone is signed up to it and understands it well. The use of scales for risk, I think, is quite high risk. When we're communicating risks in health to individuals, say about the chance of surviving another 10 years with your cancer, we'd never use words. And you wouldn't just use a scale, rating scale. You would say, out of 100 people like you who tick your boxes, we'd expect 70 to still be alive in 10 years, and show them a little block of 100 blobs and 70 of them coloured in. And as research has shown, that's a very effective way to show people. You show them, for a start, you do the part to whole comparison. You don't just tell them about the risks, you tell them about the benefits as well. So you don't just use survival rates or mortality rates, you use both.
One of the bugbears I've got is that people often make investing mistakes because what we tend to favour are low probability, high payoff events. So, lottery ticket kind of investments. Whereas if you've got a much higher probability of a favourable outcome, but with a potentially lower return, so if you buy a global index fund and hold it for your whole lifetime, that's much less attractive. How can you communicate the best outcome?
Well, I'm one of those people who, my investment is just to put it on a tracker and that's it. And I just sit there watching it go up and down.
Yeah.
I'm extremely cautious. And also, I don't go in for buying lottery tickets and, long shots like that. And certainly wouldn't believe in putting a lot of investment into that. So it depends, as well known, of course, depends on people's personality, their risk appetite and so on. But as you say, the crucial thing is that people know what they're doing and know what they're in for. And again, I think that, some visualization of possible futures, you could say, oh, this can go up and down. No, actually, I'd like to see what is a plausible range of future scenarios. Maybe it's a sort of spaghetti plot of things that can happen on the judgment, a mixture of judgment and modeling and something like that. And if you can then illustrate the fact that you've got a tiny chance of a very big reward, but almost a, universal chance of not doing very well, or possibly a chance of losing a lot, then you should be presented with that in a way that is gripping and gets through to you, and not just hidden away in language that can mean many different things to different people. The crucial thing is you can't assume that people know what you know, and that audiences, and particularly, say, for me, for investments, I'm completely dim-witted and haven't got a clue what's going on. So I just do the easiest, simplest thing. And you have to take into account the capacity of the audience. You have to listen to the audience. What we've done in our work is essentially going to co-production. You work with the audiences to constantly checking what you're doing makes sense, is reasonable, is effective, and co-produce it with the people that you're actually trying to communicate to.
I think with lottery tickets and lottery ticket style investments, most people probably understand that the expected value, the expected return is negative, but they buy them anyway. Is that kind of what differentiates investing and gambling in your mind?
In my latest book, I use the sort of analysis that people like Kahneman and Tversky have gone through, that the standard expected utility model just doesn't work very well in so many circumstances. And so in lotteries, you've got a small probability of a large gain, so people become very risk prone. They pay far more than the expected gain for a ticket, which is actually, I think, completely reasonable thing to do. It's your one chance to change your life if you desperately want to get out of how you're living, which I don't, so I don't buy lottery tickets. But it is your one chance. So I get very cross when people say, oh, people are so irrational, they're not obeying the rules of subjective expected utility. Well, of course they don't, because they don't work. And why should they? So I very strongly feel that in personal decisions, trying to be a rational economic being is actually a very spurious objective. And it certainly doesn't describe what people want to do.
I certainly don't think expected value is everything, is it? I mean, if you think about insurance products, for example, I assume the expected value is generally negative because, after all, the insurance company has to make a profit from its customers. But you'd be really glad you bought the insurance policy if the worst happens.
Yeah, again, people are essentially risk prone. They pay over the odds to prevent a very large loss. And so this is completely sensible behavior, because the idea of expected value kind of assumes you're in it for the long term, that all these things are going to average out in the end. But in fact, if you're faced with a catastrophic loss, you don't want to wait for the long term at all. The crucial thing is that it's a very different perspective from a company who's offering a product where you can average over the long term, and an individual who's faced with their own irrevocable decisions. You could say that in facing climate change on our planet, we haven't got a lot of planets to play with and to take an average, and therefore possibly a more precautionary approach, is quite a rational thing to do.
Absolutely.
So in your book, you show this premium bond that was bought for you when you were age 5, and apparently it's now just worth 3% of its 1958 value. So that's a nice example of the effect of inflation. And you never won a prize.
Well, I don't know. I might have. I don't think I did.
Do you think that people understand the trade-offs when it comes to premium bonds? Because it's quite complicated.
It is quite complicated. I think people do understand premium bonds. I've got the full whack. I love premium bonds because I love getting a little notice saying I've won so much every month. I tend to win every month. And I keep a spreadsheet check and I get a pretty good return. I think it's quite reasonable, considering I don't lose my stake. And I think people do understand it. The idea of a chance of winning, which again, of course, if you've got a lot, it averages out. So again, it really depends on whether whether expectation is a reasonable thing in your life. I mean, I think expectation is incredibly important, but if you are only looking at a few events, expectation becomes a poorer summary of a distribution of possible outcomes. And the range of that distribution becomes even more important. So this is, to do with the fact that the variance is just as important as the expectation, of course.
Out of interest, do you ever buy normal gilts, normal government bonds?
No, I don't know anything about all that stuff. No, it's got to be really simple for me. I'm a dimwit when it comes to investments or anything. I couldn't care less. I'm bored by the whole thing. I've got no interest in it whatsoever.
Let's not tell our audience that.
You can cut that then if you want. Yeah.
No, keep it in.
Oh, brilliant.
I mean, it seems to me that a lot of market expectations are often driven by this idea that certain variables will revert to their mean. They go back to their long-term average over time. But I'm interested in, how does this idea of mean reversion, maybe it's around the idea of stock valuations, how does that coexist with the gambler's fallacy, which is the idea that, if we're flipping coins and we get 3 tails, everyone thinks the next one's bound to be a heads. How do you square mean reversion with that wrong-headed belief?
Yeah, really, they're both, I think they are related, because what I would call regression to the mean, after a run of, perhaps extreme events, which luck will have contributed to their extreme value, you expect that it will come back to a more stable situation. And similarly, if you're flipping a coin and you flip 3 tails, you said, a head is due. Well, this is nonsensical. But what we do know is that in the end, you will get back to 50-50. And it's not because there is some magical force that impels a head to come up. It's just that the new information swamps the previous information. So similarly, if you're looking at a series and you had a row of peaks, if you think that part of the reason that happened, rather than an absolutely systematic change, there's some reason behind that, being systematically different from the past, then I think it is quite reasonable to think that future data drawn from the same distribution will swamp those run of extreme results. But the crucial thing is you have to believe in a stable process in which things will balance out in the end, not because of some magical power, but because extremes happen just by chance. And if you've had a row of good luck or bad luck, then it'll come to an end.
I guess one of our questions is about people reasoning with emotion, because what I often see is that people, for example, there's a stock market crash and then people are risk averse for a very long period after that. So how can we avoid reasoning with emotion and maybe make it more based on evidence?
Yeah, I mean, in my new book, I do talk about the fact that when faced with uncertainty, one should try to think slowly, using Danny Kahneman's idea of thinking fast and slow. And thinking fast is using your gut feelings, your emotions, which works for us well in most situations. But actually, when you're faced with important decisions in the face of uncertainty, you should really try to think slowly. But as Kahneman emphasizes, it's not just a matter of choosing between the analytic approach and a gut feeling approach. It's inevitably a combination of the two. As he says, nobody ever made a decision from a formula. Or if they did, you can have another financial crash. So the crucial thing is, I believe, to use analytic processes, to use forecasting models, to do it the best you can to model a process using your best understanding, but of course trying to build some resilience, some robustness to unforeseen circumstances, perhaps, but never believe it. It's always wrong. It's always a fiction. All models are wrong. They're the maps, not the territory. They're caricatures of the real world. They can never embody the full complexity of the world around us, and especially people's behavior. It can never do that. So you have to, I believe, work on the analysis, but never believe it, and never be driven by it as if it's some God-given truth in the corner. And most of the time, I think, we should take it into account. We should listen to it very carefully. Again, in our work in medical examples, I've worked on prediction methods for people with breast and prostate cancer. And as I mentioned earlier, we can give a 70% chance of living 10 years or something like that. But we're never saying it's your risk. It's never the risk of this patient. All we can say is that out of 100 people who ticked the boxes that you ticked, we would expect 70 to live 10 years. Each individual patient will be different. There always will be unique factors. So how these systems are used, the medical meetings, all the specialists are sitting around trying to decide on options they can present to the patient. And Predict, which is what the system's called, comes up with its judgment. And it's treated as I think, slightly boring, rather dull individual in the corner who just puts out this algorithmic output. But it's then used as the baseline for the discussion, to move it up or down depending on the specific patient's circumstances, their desires, their feelings. And so I think that's a really valuable use of an algorithmic process. It's not believed. It's not the computer says yes, the computer says no. It's used as a baseline in order then to use judgment, expertise, and personal knowledge of the individual circumstances to adjust, possibly not too much.
So it's a way of avoiding base rate neglect, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And it provides a common level in medicine, certainly, that can be used throughout the world, so that a basic level of expertise is provided for everybody, which is extremely valuable. And then the discussion can start. And you might just want to follow it slavishly. And we've seen what problems that led to.
One of the challenges with predicting financial markets is that there's so much information that goes into them. They're incredibly complicated systems that reflect the real world. And if we're thinking about who might be better than others at forecasting, you have this distinction in your book between hedgehogs and foxes. Do you want to explain that? And we can work out who's a hedgehog and who's a fox here.
Yeah. Well, this is much more in the area of what I might call super forecasting, in a way, non-model based predictions about world events. So, which is something I'm fascinated by, where individuals are given a prediction or a statement about the future that, I don't know, some outcome about Russia-Ukraine war in a year's time, and then they come up with a probability of it based on their expertise, their knowledge, their judgment, and so on. And they never say what's going to happen. It's always a probability. And then those probabilities are assessed using a scoring rule, what's called a proper scoring rule, which I spend quite a lot of time on in the book, because I think they're absolutely vital in understanding how to assess probabilistic forecasts.
I found that fascinating. It was the idea that you sort of punish overconfidence in the scoring.
Yeah, the point about scoring, if you say 10 out of 10 and you're right, you get 25 points. If you say 10 out of 10 and you're wrong, you lose 75. And it deliberately designed, it's really harsh. Oh, God, it's hard. But it's both designed to encourage people to be honest about their uncertainty and to massively punish gross overconfidence. I think everybody should be trained on these rules who's got any role in making any judgments about the future, whether it's in finance or anything else. And of course, it was developed in weather forecasting. That's where it came from, 1951. And it's used in forecasting competitions. And what they found, the people who did that, like Phil Tetlock, who ran these competitions, found that certain people were definitely better than others. And he identified the characteristics of those people, which he said they were more like foxes and hedgehogs. And this goes back to a distinction made many years ago between different approaches to really almost different worldviews. And the idea that hedgehogs are people who have a worldview. They have a theory for how the world works. And, they could be Marxists, they could be Keynesians, they could be something else. And that everything is crammed into that framework.
In our space, that would be crypto bros.
Well, whatever. Yeah. But it then dominates their thinking about making predictions. Now, foxes are people with no ideology. They've got no isms at all. They will respond to new evidence. They're incredibly open-minded. They don't want things to happen. They really just look coldly at the world, will change their minds quickly when new information is obtained. They're open to combining evidence from multiple sources, and they're very happy giving probabilities. And foxes are better at making predictions. I suppose in the book and elsewhere, I'd say we've got to encourage fox-like mentality, which is agile, which is self-critical, which avoids groupthink, and so on. And so this is what intelligence services are trying to do when they establish, for example, red teams, teams of analysts that deliberately go out to be miserable sods and criticize and think of what can go wrong.
The risk department at the investment bank, Roman.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Ministry of Defence have got whole handbooks on setting up red teams and how to develop a red team mindset. And I think it's incredibly valuable. I always try to do it myself, but I'm hopeless. I dread to think I'm a bit of a hedgehog, in fact, because I'm so damn optimistic. So nobody should ever take my advice about anything. So I think these ideas are really valuable in any decisions that depend on unknown futures.
It seems that in the real world, you've got to be a bit skeptical about what people claim to think the probability is of an event happening and what they truly believe. In your book, there's this great amusing anecdote about the mad cow disease BSE crisis, where the British minister goes on TV to eat some British beef with his daughter to demonstrate that beef is safe.
Well, that's why in the book I do talk quite a lot about trustworthy communication and really set out some basic frameworks for trustworthy communication, which includes trying to be honest with the audience and actually owning up to uncertainties. I emphasize in the book John Krebs' approach when he was chair of the Food Standards Agency and was faced with endless crises of BSE and foot and mouth and scrapie and everything, just one crisis after another. And he developed a playbook for communicating in a state of crisis in which he did first of all say what we are confident about, what we know. But then he said what we don't know, followed it up with that. And then he said what we're doing about it, what the research we're doing, the experiments we're doing. And then he said, in the meantime, we are advising that you do X, possibly precautionary, to be on the safe side. But the fifth point is the most important one. But this is provisional. It will change. We will learn more and our advice will change, which prevents this ghastly thing that happened in COVID with the government painting themselves into a corner with their advice that then they couldn't change because they'd been so damn confident in it in the first place. And so people were still wiping surfaces and cleaning their shopping a year later when we all knew it was a complete waste of time.
It was really hard to give that habit up of scrubbing all the groceries. But in the mad cow disease example, did he eat the burger? Did he let his daughter eat the burger?
If you look at the photograph very carefully, it's not the bite mark of a 5-year-old girl. His daughter didn't eat the burger.
There's a saying in investment that don't tell me what you think, tell me what you have in your portfolio.
Yeah, again, it's in my book, I just emphasize this really pragmatic approach to predictions using scoring rules. It's really cold, hard, empirical evidence about the quality of predictions, how important that is.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 stocks and shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and the lowest FX fees I could find on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. If you trade US stocks, then 24/5 trading gives you non-stop market access from Monday until Friday via more trading sessions, while still using Trading 212's fractional shares and zero commission trading. You can also switch between 24/5 and regular hours orders at any time. Customers can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which offers 1.5% cash back on all transactions until January the 1st, 2025. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 Invest or Stocks ISA account, make a minimum deposit of £1 and use the promo code RAMIN, RAMIN, within 10 days of signing up, or use the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk and you may get back less than invested. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Pies and Autoinvest is an execution-only service. Not investment advice or portfolio management. Automatic investing refers to executing scheduled deposits. You are responsible for all investment and rebalancing decisions. Free shares can be fractional, terms and fees apply. So all the time in the financial press, you get two experts talking about the same thing, and they'll come out with different conclusions. And we see that with modelling as well. We see two different models come up with different conclusions. So how can we deal with those disagreements between models? What's the approach?
I think this is so important, and COVID really revealed, I thought, an excellent process. Remember the R number. Every week we were told, which is the average number of people you'd expect an infected person to go on to infect. And there were 8 different teams with, I think, 12 different models. Very different sorts of models as well. Some were sort of different, complex differential equations, some were agent-based, some were really quite simple deterministic ones. I wouldn't have trusted any one of those models, because if you looked at the estimates and the intervals around those models that came out of it, often they didn't even overlap. So these models really disagreed with each other. But once a week, that community got together and they criticized each other. Tell me why I'm wrong was the process they went through on that. And they came up with a composite opinion, which was, really an average of these things, which was the uncertainty in the composite opinion was far higher than the uncertainty on each of the models, because you couldn't trust the uncertainty in each of the models, because the uncertainty was assessed assuming the model was correct. And the one thing we know is that they're all wrong. So you should never believe a model-based assessment of uncertainty. You never believe it, because it's assuming the assumptions are correct, and we know they aren't. So I thought that was a very good process of multiple independent teams. They did speak to each other. Same things happen in climate change, multiple teams, and you provide a composite over the model. You don't try to decide who's right and who's wrong, because they're all wrong. So what's the point? You could possibly weight differently according to their past capacity for prediction. So there are methods for doing that, same as there are when you're weighting individual forecasters. But often just a simple linear combination works as well as anything else. So I think model combination is much better to think of than model choice.
And once we move beyond models and we get people out there in the real world and in finance buying stocks and trading other assets, what you find is beating the market is incredibly difficult. Only around 10% of active managers ever achieve it, net of fees, over a decade. The stats just back that up. That's what empirically has happened. And even those who do outperform in any given year might just be lucky. And you see that the persistence over time is poor. The people who are good one year and not so good the next year. And in your book, you explain the danger of looking at league tables, because you always get these in finance. You see the best performing funds each year and the worst performing. And people think it's all down to skill. But how uncertain are those places in a league table?
League tables are the worst way to summarize performance because they claim differences when there are no differences. In the book I talk about football. I don't care about football, but it's a good example of where people make huge claims about who's the best team and who's doing well and this sort of thing. A lot of it is luck. I calculate that in the Premier League last year, out of the final distribution of scores in the league table, points in the league table, about 42% was just pure luck. The point is that if you realize in football, if they just came out at the beginning of a football match and flipped a coin, and if it was heads, the home team won, and if it was tails, they flipped it again, and then if it came up heads, the away team won, and otherwise it was a draw, and then they could all walk off the pitch, and you'd end up with pretty well exact proportions, because roughly speaking, 50% of matches are home wins, 25% of draws, and 25% away wins. So you would end up with those statistics matching. Now, the point is, at the end of the season, which I think it'd be great if football were like that.
Roman would prefer it, let me tell you that.
Yeah, exactly. But, it wouldn't make a great audience game, I don't think. But you would end up with a league table at the end of the season, and somebody would be top and somebody would be bottom. And people could argue about why they were someone was top and why someone was bottom. It'd be complete nonsense. It was pure luck who was there. And next season, there'd be in a completely different order, and you'd get regression to the mean, that people at the extremes would then come towards the average. Now, of course, it's not quite like that, but it's not far off. And so we've developed league tables, analyzed league tables from schools, from hospitals, and to find that most of the ranking is completely spurious. And in the Premier League, you could only be confident that out of the teams, there are about 4, you could be pretty confident in the top half, and 4, you're pretty confident in the bottom half, and all the rest, you didn't know which half they were in.
So interesting.
The rank of a team in a league table is one of the most uncertain statistics there is that you can ever calculate. But there are methods for actually assessing an interval around the rank. And it's really sobering, because you realize that people spend so long arguing about stuff for which there is no actual evidence of difference.
I mean, I am a football fan. And what I liked about how you phrased it in your book is that the Premier League's kind of in the Goldilocks zone in some ways, because there's enough randomness and luck that the underdog can win some games. But over a season, the best team is, I think you say something like 80% likely to win.
Yeah, it is really good. And so leagues where it's all random. I mean, lower Scottish leagues have traditionally been almost completely random. There's essentially no difference between the teams. And so you get a very inconsistent ranking each year. But if it's completely predictable, if there are a couple of really good, some countries have got such an enormous difference between the top teams and the bottom teams, the matches become utterly predictable. And so the Premier League working at about 40% luck does seem to be quite a good Goldilocks zone.
I reckon fund managers are at way more than 40% luck in their league table.
So there is a really bad history of making financial forecasts for things like the S&P 500 or the FTSE 100. And I think a lot of it is down to the distributional assumptions about the returns of these indices. Now, obviously, people often think in terms of a Gaussian distribution and normal distribution, the bell shape. And obviously, normal markets, real markets, have a much bigger tail. So does it make it harder to make accurate forecasts if you've got these fat tails?
In the book, I talk a lot about power tails, and which could just be T distributions, what are power tails, but sometimes they're really heavy, so that you can't even calculate an expectation. But I think they're really important, and it shouldn't make it any more difficult to give a forecast. You can give a forecast. The crucial thing is not the forecast, it's the distribution around that forecast. It's the width of the uncertainty. So the forecast, in terms of if you wanted a point estimate, could be actually rather similar, whether you assume narrow or wider tails, but the uncertainty will be massively wider. And that is so important about warning people about the possible upsides and downsides. Now, whether anyone listens to that is another matter, which is why the communication of uncertainty is so important. And that's why I actually am still a firm believer in the Bank of England fan charts, the fact that they do not give a central estimate. They don't want people anchoring on the Bank of England thinks inflation will be 2% in next year or 3 years' time. There's a few aspects about that I like. Not giving a central estimate, only using a broad 30 and 60 and 90% bands. But then the really important thing is that they don't model the tails. Outside that central 90% distribution, we're not going to say what the shape of the tails is. And so when COVID comes along and GDP drops by 25%, does like that, they go, it's fine. That was in the tail. We were right. We're not wrong. So I love that. And so it's a warning to be resilient to possible extremes. And I really like that. And we're getting into the area of deeper uncertainty here about dealing with where models break down, where things become unstable. Certainly a Gaussian distribution is just nonsense. And so how do we deal with that? And various people have suggested various options. And I like the Bank of England idea, which is to sort of say, well, we're going to produce a model which should work most of the time, but we're warning you that sometimes all bets are off and it's going to go, we don't know where it's going to go. And this is a bit like saying we're going to give probabilities to a list of possible futures, but also we're going to give a probability to none of the above.
Yeah. Bank of England's had a lot of none of the above over the last 2 years.
A lot of none of the above. Isn't that great? So you could list your future scenarios and you work out your scenario and you can think about probability. Yeah. But you leave a bit of probability over for none of the above.
David, I don't want to ruin your day, but the recent review of the Bank of England by Ben Bernanke has scrapped the fan charts.
It's dreadful. I do in the book. I really don't agree with this review whatsoever. I thought it was deeply flawed.
When you're talking about market crashes and their sort of potential likelihood, the one that I think looms in a lot of investors' minds is the one in the Great Depression in America. Began in 1929, US stock market fell 90% over the course of 2 terrible years. And people think, could it happen again? Now, I guess we know it's possible and it could happen again because it's happened, but it's happened once in 100 plus years the US stock market's been going. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a once in 100-year event, does it? How do we assess the probabilities of these very, very rare things?
Very difficult. After, in 2010, when eruption of the Icelandic volcano closed airspace over Europe, and that event wasn't even in the National Risk Register, because why would we have volcanoes in our National Risk Register? And so, some policy had to be made very rapidly indeed. Now, of course, volcanoes are definitely in our National Risk Register. And I, in fact, did some of the analysis for a different sort of volcanic eruption, an effusive eruption, which is associated with the Laki volcano on Iceland. And the last one of those was in 1783, I think, when it killed most of the animals on. It pours, essentially rains sulfuric acid down. And it killed a quarter of the population in Iceland, wrecked crops right across Europe. It's said that this was a major cause of the French Revolution, was this volcano that went off.
That's a better metaphor than the butterfly's wing, isn't it? The Icelandic volcano.
Yeah, exactly. Essentially, it's 1 in 500 or 1,000-year event or something like that. So what sort of protection do you build in against that? And in the National Risk Register, they do talk about events that are that rare, are talking about. So what resilience do you build into that? And you could think the same about, catastrophic space weather events, which could take out the satellite system and the national grid, etc. So what resilience do you build in on the basis? And at some point, I would hope that somebody is thinking about these things and building in resilience, not just trying to optimize for, a stable process, but building in, which inevitably, of course, is wasteful. It's inevitably you're going to be building in resilience to things that don't happen. It means you're not optimizing. You're always over-resourcing and so on. So it's a careful balance to make.
I mean, you see exactly that, don't you? After you get a certain period of time away from a financial crisis, you get this deregulation, which is just starting the process where we're going to get the next financial crisis, usually.
Now, in the book, you draw a distinction between 3 different types of luck, which was fascinating. I'd never heard that before. Could you maybe explain how they differ?
If you think of luck, I don't think of luck as some sort of external magical force. I just think of it as a way of describing past events, things that were, unpredictable, were not in our control, and yet had a big impact on our lives. And I think the most important type of luck is what they call constitutive luck, which is just who we were born as. When we came into this world, where were we in time, in place, who our parents were, what our environment was, what our genes were, and so on. Now, that has a massive influence on everything that happens to us from then on. We've got to admit it. We'd love to think that our successes were due to our hard work and our intelligence and things like that. Wow.
Have you seen the Warren Buffett quote about constitutive luck? which I think is brilliant. He said, if I had been born 3 million years ago, I would have been some animal's lunch. I can't run very fast. I can't climb trees. I can't do anything. I would just be chewed up on the first day. So how lucky am I to be born when and where I was? It was 50-1 to be born in the United States. And I'm lucky to be wired in such a way that in a market economy, it pays off like crazy for me.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm glad he recognized it. And instead of saying, oh, I'm such a clever person and I've used all my skills. No, as you said, it's how you're wired. And what this suggests, of course, is that one should be emphasizing you do the best with the hand you've been dealt, because that is so massively influential. It's in a way, it's unfortunate. That's the way it is. And of course, we should do our best to help people who are not born in not so fortunate circumstances. I was born incredibly fortunate. I had enormous constitutive luck, massive. And then the other type of luck is circumstantial luck. It's being at the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, being on a plane that develops problems or flies into a mountain or something. So all those aspects which we're familiar with. And then, of course, that in itself could go one way or another. So outcome luck is how it actually works out for you at that particular time. So somebody might survive a plane crash or not. And I think all is really useful to deconstruct apparently, chance events in terms of these. And always in thinking this way, I think it just brings a massive humility about, well, for a start, the fact that we're here at all. I use in the book a story of my grandfather who should have been killed. He really shouldn't be here, in which case I wouldn't be here talking to you. So I'm only here due to a massively, what I call a chain of micro contingencies, each of which could so easily not have happened.
But he was fighting in the First World War, wasn't he?
Yeah. Bad constitutive luck of being born just in time to go into the First World War. Terrible circumstantial luck of finding himself as brigade gas officer in the Ypres salient just after the Battle of Passchendaele, a job which must have had, he lasted 3 weeks, which I reckon was pretty good going before he was blown up on his tour of the trenches. And fantastic outcome luck because he survived and was put back behind the front lines.
The best time to get blown up.
Yeah, exactly. It was a really good time to get blown up.
Investing is all about making decisions in uncertain markets. And in PensionCraft, we have Monte Carlo saving and withdrawal tools that let you get a handle on uncertainty. Why not try them out by joining our community? Just go to pensioncraft.com/membership to learn more.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week is, would you want to know when you will die? Now, this is something you talk about a little bit in your book.
Yeah, I don't think that's a dumb question at all. I always ask it of my audiences. It's so interesting. And usually about 1 in 10 will put their hands up. And I always say, why? And so, I can plan everything. I can spend all my money. I can work out what I've got to do. I feel like saying, what if it's next week? But I have to say, of course, I can't do this. But what it does show is there's a huge range in the way we react as humans to uncertainty. And some people are more averse to uncertainty than others. Some people really like to plan their holidays exactly, want to know what they're doing all the time, want everything to be laid out in detail, and can, in fact, become very disturbed by doubt about what's going to happen. And, there's a clinical condition of intolerance of uncertainty, and there are whole scales you can fill in to decide your tolerance to uncertainty. What it illustrates is that there is a huge variability. The other thing it illustrates, of course, is when I say, I can't tell you, is the enormous uncertainty about when you will die. I mean, I can consult life tables and look at my own life expectancy. It was they tell me it's about 17 years at the moment, but I don't think it is. I've got cancer, but there again, I'm really quite healthy and I'm quite fit and et cetera, et cetera. So lots of things balance out. I could make a sort of judgment, but there is huge uncertainty about when I'm going to die. Thank goodness, honestly. I mean, I thank goodness for the uncertainty in our lives. I can't think of anything worse than having a predictable life.
Well, I don't think I'd want to know when I will die. But then again, the thorniest problem in financial planning is this idea of retirement. And we've got a pot, we've got to make it last. There's so many variables. What's my asset returns going to be? What should I have in my portfolio? And one of the biggest uncertainties is, like you say, we don't know how long we're going to live.
Well, that's why in the book, I really big up Halley. I mean, who cares about his comet and all that nonsense? Halley's brilliant contribution, 1697, I think it was, where he developed the whole idea of life tables by using data on the age at which people died. But he didn't just develop the idea of life tables. From that, he worked out the pricing of annuities and life insurance, because previously they'd been selling annuities for the same price no matter how old you were. And so he worked out...
Arbitrage so much there.
Yeah, exactly. You just do it when you're young, pay it when you're young. So he did all of that in the late 1690s. The lovely thing I describe in the book, his life table went up to 80, and he outlived his own life table by living till 82, which
Brilliant.
is great.
I don't want to know when I'll die, but I'd like a 2-year warning, do you know? To start getting ready.
So look, both of us have read your book, The Art of Uncertainty, How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk and Luck. I think we've covered a lot of the topics which you talk broadly, but I really would recommend it for people who just want some kind of introduction into statistics and also how to reason about uncertainty, which, like you say, it affects every aspect of our life. It's not just about investment.
It's a brilliant book, and you illustrate with so many amazing anecdotes, which you've shared some of today. They just stick in my mind.
Good. That's the whole point. Narrative-driven nonfiction. That's what it is.
Thank you, David.
Thanks so much. A real pleasure to do this. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Do send us your questions, no matter how dumb, at the email address mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.